This lecture will give you some social, political, and literary context for understanding the Middle Ages in Great Britain. I've created a timeline in the Prezi so that you can go back if you get confused about where we are in time and look at it on your own. I'll provide you with the links to the Prezi to kind of keep up with when things happened and where things happened if you get a little confused, because I know we're covering such a large, expansive amount of history that this might help you in the long run. So, in this section, we're going to be talking about the Norman conquest, and happens in 1066 when William of Normandy comes from France and uh, enters into England and conquers, also known as William the Conqueror, England, and takes control of the country. Because of this, there are some effects on England. This helps to develop and create the myths of King Arthur, giving England an ancient history, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about Mallory at a later time. For now, let's focus on some of the effects of the Norman invasion that happen more quickly than the creation of the Arthurian legend. The first thing is, with the Normans comes a new system of government, the feudal system, which we'll talk about more in a second, the Latin culture from the continents, and a new language. Norman French becomes the language of the courts of law, literature, and most nobility. And so that adds on to that layer of languages in the history of the English language that we've been discussing. So the Normans bring a new political system to England, and it is the feudal system. Feudalism is the dominant social system in medieval Europe, and it's which the nobility held lands for the crown in exchange for military service, and vassals were in turn tenants of the nobles, while the peasants were obliged to live on their lord's land, give him homage, labor, and share of the produce in exchange for military protection. So this video will explain the feudal system to you a little more clearer than I might have.
Medieval way of life known as feudal was based on the ownership of land, and feudal social classes reflected how much land people owned. Royalty, like kings and queens, were in the highest class. After them came the noble lords such as dukes and earls. They were followed by the knights, who were followed by skilled craftsmen, who were followed by the lowly serfs who worked the land. Under the feudal system, people of lower classes showed their respect to the upper classes by serving them, and for their service they received rewards. For example, the lord of a great castle might serve his king by supplying him with knights and soldiers for a war. To show his appreciation for this service, the king might reward the lord with a gift of land, usually in the form of a manor, which was an important unit of territory in feudal society. A manor usually came complete with a large house like this one, several farms, and at least one village along with all the serfs who lived in it. The crops grown on these lands supplied the lord with his income, and the more manors he had, the richer he became. The serfs who belonged to the manors never got rich. They were at the bottom of feudal society because they owned no land. Serfs were not even allowed to move away from a manor without the lord's permission, because his wealth depended on the labor they supplied. The lord rewarded his serfs for the service of their labor by giving them a place to live, a share of the crops they raised, and protection during dangerous times. Because serfs owned no land, they had nothing to pass down from one generation to the next, so their families always remained poor. In their manor villages, they were not even allowed to grind their own grain into flour for bread. Instead, they had to pay to have it ground at the Lord's mill. In feudal society, even though serfs produced nearly all the food, did most of the hard labor, and were the largest class of people, they had few rights and almost no opportunity for education. As a result, it was nearly impossible for them to rise above the poverty that ruled their lives. While serfs provided the labor on great feudal estates, knights were highly valued for their military skills, so there were always quite a few of them on hand at a castle. Knights were professional warriors who usually fought on horseback. They were very different from the ordinary soldiers of that time because they came from wealthy families, and they were much better trained. Training for knighthood began at 8 years of age when a boy was sent to a castle to become a page, a student and servant of an experienced knight. His training went on for many years, and it wasn't just in how to fight. It was also in such things as horsemanship, reading, singing, chess, and the art of falconry. Special contests called tournaments were often held so that knights and those learning to be knights could practice the skills they needed for combat. Tournaments were popular forms of entertainment in medieval times, but they were dangerous, and knights were often severely injured participating in them. Because knights came from well-to-do families and were so valued for their fighting skills, they held a very high position in feudal society, just below the noble lords. That was why, to show them respect, knights were always addressed as Sir. A noble lord would often reward a knight for his courage with the gift of manor lands and the income they provided. So on a lord's great estate, it was not uncommon to find knights living in many of the manor houses.
Okay, so that video should have given you a little bit more of the background on feudalism, and I will also put a link of videos that I show you in any of my lectures on the D2L course shell, so that if you wanted to go back and look at them, you would have access to them without having to go back through this presentation. So one example of England's development uh, as a land of documents and books is the Domesday Book. And so the Domesday Book was a survey. The Domesday Survey was taken between Christmas 1085 and William the Conqueror's death in 1087. And what the book recorded were the holdings and earnings, everything down to how many sheep were on a particular farm. And it's really invaluable to researchers today because we know that's how we get the facts about how someone ground their wheat or how much a pig cost, those sorts of things. So there are other examples besides just the Domesday Book. This is a picture of the image of the Domesday Book, the manuscript that still survives. But there are other things besides the Domesday Book, but the Domesday Book happens to be the most famous, and it's really interesting when you're considering the impact that the Normans had, because they really started to get England organized, both monetarily and politically. So the feudal system creates what is called the three estates. And the three estates are the three different categories of people and where they fall in terms of a social class. The first estate is those who fight, and that's the aristocracy. Those are your lords and knights who are running the land, and the kings and the leaders of the land. The second estate is those who pray, and those are your members of church, of the clergy, the members of the church, the priests, the nuns, the people who are reading and praying. And then finally, the third estate is the people who work, those who work, and that's the peasants. Now, later in the Middle Ages, we'll see that a class of peasants, the mercantile class, does raise up and create this kind of new class that sits between the aristocracy and the clergy and the peasants. Kind of sits like if we had a 2B, it would be in between the clergy and the peasants in terms of hierarchy. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, what Chaucer is doing is he is writing a satire on the three estates, and the genre of the Canterbury Tales is called the estatus satire or estate satire. And what he is doing is poking fun at the feudal system and the way that the three estates interact with one another, and also the exposing some of the hypocrisy and issues within each estate, as you can see in the Nun's Priest Tale and in The Wife of Bath. So the image of a figure was envisioned with those who prayed and ruled being portrayed as the head, with those who fought, the knights, being portrayed as the hands, and those who worked being portrayed as the feet. And that's kind of how they would envision, this idea of the three estates, is that for the three estates to work, they all make up the body of England. So you have your clergy in the head, your knights with the hands, and the workers or the peasants with the feet. That's just a cool image I found for you. So because of the Norman invasion, there was also some different influences that start to come from the European continent, because now England is having more direct contact with France. And there is some great influences in the middle of the Middle Ages that definitely affect the end part of the Middle Ages in England. There's a period after William conquers of different Norman monarchs who provide a political and economical stability. And because the monarchy is stable, and because they aren't at war with the other countries, but instead are in Europe, instead are trading, it really promotes the ability for people to travel. And so learning expands, both religiously and secularly. Now people, scholars and clerics of the church, have the opportunity to go to France or go to Italy and study, Catholicism, or even go to Spain and study Arabic cultures that have been in Spain at the time, and even some of the Jewish cultures and things like that. Because the Normans came to England, it kind of opens England up to this outside influence, because before it had really been those nomadic peoples and the Celts that were influencing England. Now they start to get that European influence of the continent. And with this, the classics also invade England. Now, people in England are, because they're reading in French now, are able to read the great thinkers such as Ovid or Horace or Virgil or Seneca. And so this is just a map of medieval Europe after the Norman invasion. This is actually about 100 years after the Norman invasion, because the Norman invasion takes place in 1056. And so this is where England is right here, and this is France here, okay? And the Normans come from here and they go over here, and that's where they conquer. And so this opens up the channel because they're not at war anymore, and they're part of, essentially, they're friendly with the French now. This opens travel to France and other places in the Holy Roman Empire. Another influence of the continent on England is the idea of the trivium. Trivium. And what that is it's a fancy way of saying the study of grammar, rhetoric, and dialect. And those are the three most important studies of classical learning at this time. And these ideas start to influence the literature at the time. And by studying these things, the writers start to use allegory and metaphors and satire, three things that we'll talk about later in the lecture. And Chaucer is a good example of this with his estates satire. And Mallory is also a good example of it later, too, because he for sure uses allegory with his beast fable. And he also, I'm sorry, that's Chaucer with the beast fable, my bad. He for sure uses allegory with the legend of King Arthur when he's talking about, Arthur as the Christ-like figure. And definitely metaphorically talking about Arthur as the once chosen king with that Christian influence. Some more continental influences that I kind of had mentioned before. The language France with the Norman invasion, the French language becomes the language of the aristocracy because it's just like any business. When the company gets taken over by another company, they don't usually let everyone keep their jobs. They usually bring in their own people. And so the people in charge came in too. And so French really becomes the language of the aristocracy. And so what you get for the vernacular, which is just a fancy way of saying the everyday language, is you get this layering of French that the aristocracy is using, but that old English medieval, we talked about before, that Latin, Germanic mixture that's starting to like birth this Middle English language that we see in Chaucer, and then that kind of gets cleaned up into early modern English when we're starting to get into Mallory. And so that had a huge influence just on the language. And then the continent influenced courtly literature. When we think of King Arthur, we think of that as Britain's story, and that's their mythical history. But those stories actually started in France about Britain. Of course, there are some of the legends that have basis in Celtic legend and in Old Irish and Welsh legend as well. But the French had taken those legends to France and had created these courtly romances. And it isn't until Mallory, Mallory who creates like the English version of this. So another thing to consider is that the access to texts and private readings during this time may have promoted some of the social moving that I talked about later on in the Middle Ages, where this mercantile class starts to become wealthy and being able to read. Chaucer was part of the mercantile class, and he worked himself up to almost a royal lineage. And being able to read privately might have and read these satires and allegories might have made some of those people that before might not have felt like they could move up in the world feel like they could move up in the world. So, one of those things, knowledge is power, right? If you can't speak or write a certain way, it can exclude you from certain groups and from certain benefits in that way. And so when the lower classes in this case were able to read and write on their own, it made for some social mobility. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that anyone could work hard and work their way up, because that's really just not the truth at this time. That does happen way, way, way later. But I don't want you to mistake that. but there were before where there were no special circumstances of that ever happening. Now there were like some special circumstances of things that could happen. Okay, so what you might be saying at this point is, tell me again why we need to know all this history if this is a literature course. Well, to understand a text, you need to understand the rhetorical situation. Just to refresh your memory, the rhetorical situation is the relationship between audience, text, and author. To understand the rhetorical situation, you have to know the purpose, and that is the meaning for the intended audience. And to be able to understand the purpose of the text, you've got to understand the context of the text. And the context is meaning surrounding the text. Let's hold on. Somebody's at the door. Let me just pause this for a second. All right, sorry about that. The disadvantage of recording a lecture at home. Okay, so where were we again? So why do we need to know all this stuff? Okay, so to really understand a text, you need to understand the relationship between the audience, the text, and the author, and we call that the rhetorical situation. Okay, and understand the rhetorical situation, you got to know the purpose. In other words, why did they write it? And to understand the purpose, you got to understand the context, and that is, what are the circumstances surrounding that? Okay, so if you want to understand why a teacher creates a certain assignment, you need to understand what their ultimate goal is. And to understand what you have to produce, you need to understand who your audience is when you produce that assignment. That's your teacher, in order to create the essay. And so you have this relationship with it, right? It's the same when you're reading something from a literature course that might be difficult. In order to understand that, you got to get the background and know what's going on. Okay, so that's why I'm telling you all this history. And that's just the answer. So deriving meaning from the Middle Ages is a complex process, and these tips will help you to increase your understanding. Okay, Miss Buzzard, that's awesome and everything, but why do I need to learn this stuff if I'm not majoring in British literature? I mean, some of that's true, right? I don't think that you will be in your job unless you go into the humanities, and your professor, your boss will say, excuse me, employee, could you quickly tell me the 3 estates in feudal England? More than likely that's not ever going to happen, but there are some reasons why we learn about this stuff. First is, reading a difficult text gives you practice for other difficult genres you might encounter in your life, later in your life. I mean, if you can get through Chaucer or Thomas Malory, there are probably not that many difficult texts that you will read later in life that you cannot at least start to comprehend. Also, when you're taking classes like this, you're learning about a process, okay? You're learning about how do I get through something like this. You're learning that process of identifying the audience, identifying the purpose, identifying the relationships, that rhetorical situation. And that will help you develop your own processes in the other fields that you choose to study and work in for your life. This will also help you in turn to develop better critical reasoning skills. You know, oh, I learned this one time and so I know this. And finally, to become a better human. If we can see how the choices people made in history and that are preserved in their writings, then we can hopefully keep the great stuff and learn from the mistakes of the past. So that wraps up the explanation of what's happening politically and socially at this time in the Middle Ages.